Six Nations and the Rugby Championship, folks, the two biggest competitions outside of the Rugby World Cup on the international scale anyway. Let's have a look at the 2022 competitions for both of these premier comps, both of which I really enjoy, and just compare. Do they meet some of their stereotypes? Like, is the Six Nations just a boring old kickfest? Is the Rugby Championship basically a defence is optional and then the All Blacks walk away with the trophy bore fest of its own? We'll go through some stats. You guys can let us know your thoughts. Remember, it's just one season, so it's not really one you can draw too many trends on, but I always find it interesting to have a look at the numbers. Hopefully you guys will as well. I should say, if you guys want any rugby jerseys, check out Level Rugby. They got loads of them. I've bought loads of them from them in the past. They're just generally a pretty good rugby store if you want rugby gear. Predictable. Was either of these competitions all that predictable this year? I mean, the fact that France won the Six Nations, got a Grand Slam. I mean, they weren't predicted to get a Grand Slam. I think they were kind of underdogs to get a Grand Slam, but I think they were either the favourites or second favourites for the comp. I seem to remember them having the best draw, and they made the most of it by getting the Grand Slam. But the fact that France won the competition for the first time in about a decade, with a Grand Slam as well on top of that, was maybe not necessarily the most predictable. So not the same winner as the year before anyway. And then Italy, the team that finished at the bottom, did they finish at the bottom again? Yes. Was that pretty predictable? Yes, but they got a win. Italy didn't walk away from the competition winless. They had a 1-4 record. So would I say it's predictable? I mean, the fact that France won it is not hugely surprising, but as I said, it hadn't happened for a wee while. So that was kind of pleasing. And the fact that the Italians didn't finish their campaign with 0 was also kind of pleasing. For the Rugby Championship, did the All Blacks win again? Yes, so the same winner as the year before. But they win. They lost 2 games at home. Not 2 games at home. They lost 2 games and 1 game at home to the Argentinians. So the team that finished bottom still managed to win away at the team that ended up finishing at the top. So I thought that was kind of pleasing in itself. Did Argentina still finish at the bottom of the comp? Yes, they did. But like I said, they managed to kind of pick up 2 wins of their own. So neither competition, I think, this year was overwhelmingly predictable, even if we still had the 2 same bottom teams and one of the same winners, and then France kind of winning with what was a pretty reasonable fixtures list. So there you go. How about the scoring? Were the Rugby Championship games generally higher scoring? Yes, they averaged more tries across the competition, like 6.3 tries a game is the average compared to the Six Nations 4.9. So there are more tries in the Rugby Championship. There are more points per game, 54 compared to 43. The amount of points scored by the boot is actually pretty similar. But yeah, there are certainly more points in the Rugby Championship. One area that was kind of quite different was when the points are scored. The Six Nations is pretty even as to when the points are scored if you divide the game up into 4 20-minute periods. There's not really one that the floodgates kind of open, or, they don't start the games flying and then kind of, dry out or flow or vice versa. Whereas in the Rugby Championship, clearly the fourth quarter, that's the time you want to watch if you just want to see some points. And sadly, part of that was just the Argentinians tended to concede more points in the fourth quarter, was I think part of that. Interestingly though, in terms of how close the games were, the Rugby Championship across all their games, remember there's fewer games, but only had 2 losing bonus points were notched up in that competition. So most of the games were decided by more than 7 points, whereas the Six Nations had 6 games with losing bonus points. So generally, the games in the Six Nations are a wee bit closer. Personally, I like games that are close. It means you're on the edge of your seat. Doesn't necessarily mean for a great game. You can certainly watch a game between 2 stinker teams, and neither is able to get on top. I'm not saying that's what happened, but personally, I like the games which are close. So that's one area where the Six Nations tends to do relatively well. Interestingly, also with the try scorers, the stereotype would be probably that the Rugby Championship's all the flashy backs and the no tackling thing, whereas the Six Nations is all about the forwards and maul tries and whatnot. But it's actually the reverse. the majority of the tries in the Rugby Championship were scored by forwards, and the reverse is true for the Six Nations. It was more the backs. Top three try scorers for the Rugby Championship: Samasona Taukei'aho, Juan Martin Gonzalez, and Fraser McCright. So hooker, loose forward. Whereas for the Six Nations, it was Damien Penaud. What's the other winger? Gabin Villiers, and then James Lowe. So winger. Interesting, eh? Just how it didn't really go with the stereotype. One that's kind of a stat there on its own is that the line-out stats were remarkably better for the Six Nations. They were in the 90s, like 90.7% was the average. The Rugby Championship was down at 84. Tackling percentage, to go with the stereotype, sure enough, the Six Nations had better defending in that regard. 89% was the average tackling. Multiple teams in the 90s, which tends to be kind of the gold standard of what you want, whereas all of the Rugby Championship teams tackled in the 80s, like 86% was the average. So we're only talking like a kind of 3% difference across the board, but just generally the tackling rates are higher in the Six Nations, and the teams make more tackles. I feel like I'd have to go through the player stats to see where all the runs are coming from, but I mean, especially with Ireland, because they play such quick ball, they often make their opposition make a lot of tackles. But yeah, interestingly with the passing, a lot more passing in the Six Nations, 156 passes a game to 121, but Ireland make like 200 something passes a game, and the All Blacks, who are like the top team of the Rugby Championship, by quite some way, I think 150 odd passes a game, they're still well below Ireland's kind of relentless style. So when we're talking about such a small sample, one team can really affect the way the numbers look. But again, I just thought that's an interesting one. And the Six Nations has more offloading on average. You've got the French, I think, to thank for that. 7.3 offloads a game in the Six Nations, with France having 10. And the Rugby Championship having 6.7. So again, not much a difference in the stats. It's pretty marginal. But the All Blacks leading the way with 8.5. So yeah, I just like those kind of numbers. They actually worked out pretty even. I mean, defenders beaten is like 17.9 to 18, almost dead even. Clean breaks a game, 4.7 to 4.5, almost dead even. So it's interesting to see how many. There's just virtually no difference. Mauls was another one, like 5.4 mauls a game in the Six Nations, 5.8 in the Rugby Championship, but it's the South Africans who boost those numbers in the Rugby Championship with like 10 mauls a game. So Ireland was like 7, but yeah, I think it's the Aussies and the Italians that didn't do that much mauling. One area that was massively different was the discipline, and maybe it's a little bit concerning as we approach the November internationals. Penalties conceded a game. The Rugby Championship's 13, and the Six Nations is 10. So that's only 3 penalties, but it just meant that every Six Nations team tended to have better discipline across the tournament than the Rugby Championship. And then yellow cards, 6 to 29. Goodness me, like the Southern Hemisphere teams may be in some trouble if they play with 13 or 14 guys on the field, like we saw multiple times in the Rugby Championship. Although I think the Six Nations had 2 red cards, the Rugby Championship's 1. Still, across the board, a lot more cards for the Southern teams. Remember, they had a mixture of refs as well, Southern and Northern ones. Squad ages were pretty similar. The Northern Hemisphere teams were generally a bit younger in the Six Nations. The Southern Hemisphere teams were generally a bit heavier. The South Africans and New Zealanders in particular, although the French pack was monstrous. The Italians tended to be a bit on the light side, likewise. The Australians. And the age-old one of the old kicking. Yes, actually, the Six Nations did feature a fair bit more kicking from hand, with 28 kicks a game compared to 21 for the Rugby Championship. But it's interesting, like with the Rugby Championship teams, there wasn't that much variation. I think the South Africans were like 24, and the Australians were like 19, so not a huge difference. Whereas in the Six Nations, the Italians and the French genuinely kick a lot more than everybody else. So yeah, there you go, folks. The action stuff, the defenders beating, the clean breaks, was all pretty even. The Rugby Championship does have a few more tries scored. The defence is not quite as high if you're just looking at the pure numbers. Take it for what it's worth, folks. It is just one season's stats. As I said, I like to have a look at them. The Six Nations games tended to be a bit closer, and I enjoyed both. But there you go, folks. Hope you guys found that some part of interesting, but it's going to be fun to see these teams go up against each other in November and a little bit in October. But you guys let us know what you reckon. Do you have a preference? I mean, obviously your team which you follow is the one that's your preferred one, but is there anything you particularly like about the Six Nations or like about the Rugby Championship or dislike? You guys let us know your thoughts, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. See you later.